right, we're going to be looking at the last part of Acts chapter 25, and also try to get through chapter 26 tonight. Before we do that, Will had asked a question last week about some of Paul's epistles and when they were written, and whether, I think, kind of asked if they fit into this time period or not. If I'd been thinking, and I've been like Dennis, you know what he does when somebody asks a question like that. He says, that's a good question. Why don't you figure that out for us and tell us next week? But did anybody do any studying on that? Anybody look into it any? Do what?
Were they written from Rome after it had left?
Well, I would say at least two of them are for sure. You're talking about the second imprisonment?
Both of the imprisonments in Rome.
Yeah. I know Philippians was for sure. We know that because it mentions the Praetorian Guard, which would have been the Roman Guard. And it seems like, again, it kind of depends on if you have the two imprisonment view or the one imprisonment view. And some people believe Paul was just imprisoned one time and that was the end of it. There's some statements that are kind of hard for me to figure out if that be the particular case. But it's generally believed, the ones that kind of have references to it are going to be your, Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians and Philemon. And so you kind of have references to Paul being in bondage, and like Philippians, it's more obvious where he's, they're in Rome being watched by the palace. He says, my bonds are known throughout all the palace. Those other three kind of mention the idea of him being in bonds or imprisonment. Now, it's generally believed that those would have been written during what we're reading about here, or maybe when he got to Rome. Like I said, the only one that I'd say for sure was written in Rome is Philippians. That's pretty obvious. But remember, he was under arrest for 2 years here. And I don't know, kind of thinking about Paul, kind of weird that he wouldn't write some kind of letter during those 2 years and save it all for Rome for the next 2 years. But probably that first imprisonment, those are going to be the four that were written during that time. Again, I don't know specifically where, and that's always a debate, where and what exact time. The second imprisonment, we know 2 Timothy's written for sure in the second imprisonment. Most people think that Titus and 1 Timothy was written also during that second imprisonment. So, I don't know. There's not really any evidence in those books themselves that you can point to and say Paul was definitely in prison when he wrote those things. But that's kind of the general consensus in thinking. So, it is kind of interesting, though, to think about when you read those books and some of the things that were written in them, what Paul's going through at this particular time and how that would have affected him. And again, even some of the things that we read about in the book of Acts here, you can kind of see those things reflected in some of those books in his writing. So that's my best stab at it. Again, a lot of it's just kind of trying to put pieces of the puzzle together. It doesn't really say in black and white in a lot of those places, but it does seem like, to me at least, that Paul was in prison twice. And I'll say for sure, two of them were written from Rome, and the other four, I guess the other, 5, I'm not really for sure exactly at what point, in his imprisonment they were written, but I do believe they were written during his prison stay, whether it be the first or the second. So, go ahead.
I know Paul wanted to go to Rome immediately after Jerusalem, but without these imprisonments, how much of the New Testament would we might not have?
Yeah, it certainly freed him up, didn't it? Because he had a lot more time on his hands than traveling that he usually did. But, even during those imprisonments, part of what we've been studying about is he still had a lot of freedom. And so he still was able to preach the gospel. He still was able to receive people, and people were able to bring things to him. He was evidently able to write letters and send those out too. So there was still a lot of work that he did during those imprisonments. But yeah, it certainly, we're talking about what? 7 books there? And Hebrews, if he wrote that when it was written. Dennis doesn't know about that one for sure, but what time period was it written to? So it's certainly a busy time as far as letters, I think we're concerned in his life. Okay, so anybody got anything to add to that? Or any other questions I can't answer? All right. Will's up next for the next question. So, all right, let's talk about our discussion question, or think about it question. And question number 1 on your handout, that question is simply this: do you ever enjoy telling stories from your past? How many of you have ever told a story from your past? Okay? You generally enjoy telling those stories? Danny says,
wouldn't tell.
do what?
Your master, you wouldn't tell.
Yeah, usually ones we don't enjoy. We probably don't want to repeat those, do we? But I would say probably all of us have some stories from our past that we probably tell on a pretty consistent basis. And just depending on the situation that we're in. Probably all of us have some funny story from our past that we could tell when called upon. It may have to do something with your job. You may have a story about your job that you tell at certain times. Or, it could be even a sad story to kind of relate to whatever experience we're facing at the present time. But you think about Paul. Did Paul have any stories to tell? Yeah. And one of the stories that he tells the most is a story about his conversion, isn't it? This is going to be the 3rd time that we read about it, where he's telling it within the book of Acts itself. And, I could probably tell you the story about my conversion, but it's not going to be exciting or anything like Paul. I mean, if our conversion was like Paul's, do you think he'd tell that story a lot? Probably would. Even though he's inspired while he's telling these stories, it probably wouldn't be something that, you would just sweep under the rug and never mention or never talk to people about. But Paul's pretty open about the things that happened to him in his conversion. And so once again, he's standing before rulers and kings, and he's going to give them the account of how he was converted to Christ, why he's doing what he's doing, why he's in prison and in chains to this very day. So we read last week about him appearing before Festus. Festus was the newcomer, didn't know a lot about the Jews, didn't know a lot about their customs, their religion, their laws, things like that. And so when he heard Paul's case, what did he want Paul to do? Or what did he ask Paul if he would do?
Jerusalem.
Go back to Jerusalem. Go back to Jewish law. Go back to Jewish religion. Go somewhere where people know something about this. And it didn't hurt either that he wanted to do the Jews a favor. And so that was kind of an opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, get rid of this trial that he didn't really understand in the first place. But then also to kind of do the Jews a favor by getting him sent back to Jerusalem. So Festus did that, or he was going to do that, but Paul appeals to Caesar. And so now Festus has to write why Paul is being sent to Caesar for a trial. And basically he's got to figure out, what are we going to charge this guy with? Because, again, Roman law, there weren't any violations. He couldn't find any. He was going to send him back to Jerusalem to kind of go through Jewish law and maybe figure something out there. But now he's got to send him to Rome, and he doesn't have any charges to write against him. Well, lo and behold, King Agrippa II comes to visit, who is an expert in Jewish customs. He's a Jew himself, but he's expert in Jewish customs and law and in religion. And so Festus asked King Agrippa if he would be willing to sit down and let Paul come and kind of tell him what had happened, so he could help him figure out, how he was going to charge him and what he was going to put in the official letters that he wrote and sent on to Rome with him. So question number 2 is this. We talked about some of these things last week, but they're kind of a spillover here in the last part of chapter 25 and into chapter 26. But the question is this. Why do you think King Agrippa wanted to hear Paul? Why do you say yes?
Curiosity.
Probably, yeah. I don't know, he obviously wasn't very close to Festus yet, I don't think. But I think probably more curiosity than anything, and I think it kind of fed his ego too, that, Festus didn't really know what to do, and he was somebody who could help him figure it out. He could give him the answers that he was looking for. But obviously, he'd heard about Jesus, he knew about the Jews, he would have known about Jesus, he would have known about Christianity, and how Jews looked down upon it, and how they basically viewed it as an attack on their religion. And so I think he was kind of interested to hear what Paul had to say on the subject, and to see how he was going to defend it, and how he was going to, try to fit it into the way of the Jewish reckoning. Because who had Paul been before this? Yeah. Who was Paul before he was a Christian? He was Saul. He was an adamant Jewish promoter. All about the law of Moses, all about persecuting Christianity, and now he's done a complete 180. And so I think probably Agrippa would have naturally been interested in what changed this guy. What came about that he changed so radically in his life. So we read about Agrippa and Bernice, his I guess live-in wife / sister, you could call it. wasn't a very good relationship. But whenever they go to hear Paul, how do they display their position of power?
So they like great men.
Yeah.
Captains and important people with them.
I mean, they're your typical people who are infatuated with worldliness. They believed that they were somebody, and they wanted everybody else to think that they were somebody too. And so this was kind of an occasion to show everybody, hey, I'm a king. And he took advantage of that occasion. That he wanted everybody to see and everybody to know, but it just kind of, again, indicates, kind of the character that he possessed. He was a very worldly individual. He, of course, sought recognition among men, mainly with Rome. That's who he really was loyal to. But he also tried to play the Jews, his own nation, to his favor as much as he could too. But he certainly put on an outward display so that everybody would know who he was, and he was entering into this position. So question number 4 here in the opening proceedings, what does Festus say to his royal guest? Let's start with what he says about Paul.
Well, first of all, he says that he wants Paul to be, he is commanded to be
Okay.
brought forth.
Yeah, he commands Paul to be brought forth. And then what does he have to say about Paul?
He also kind of wanted to know, or let everybody know that he was kind of left to deal with a situation, or a bad situation that Felix didn't want to deal with, basically.
Yeah, the first thing that really kind of stands out to me is he points out what the Jews' position is on Paul. What did the Jews, and he doesn't just say, there was a couple of Jews over here that got mad at him and they want him to put to death. What does he say?
Whole assembly of the Jews.
Yeah, all the Jews, are mad at Paul. And all of them, since the time I've entered into office here, all of them have been pleading with me to put him to death. Get him on trial and get him convicted and put him to death. And so he kind of, think about that. If you were appearing in a court case and this is the first thing that the judge says about you, I mean, how would that make you feel?
Change of judge.
Yeah. It make you feel like, I'm probably not going to be able to win this thing, right? He's already kind of pronouncing me to be guilty from the viewpoint of all these Jews, and so I'm probably not going to fare too well in this trial. So what did Festus bring, or why? Question 5. Why did Festus bring Paul before this group? And it wasn't just King Agrippa, right? Who else was it?
Priest or chief priest.
Yeah, you have a lot of the Jewish leaders here that are present in this trial too. So what does he hope to accomplish by bringing them in? Yeah, so he had to figure out what he's going to charge him with, right? And obviously, he was scratching his head. He didn't have anything definite. He didn't have anything well established where he could say, this is why I'm sending Paul to appear before Caesar in a Roman court. And so he was hoping that they could help come up with some kind of charge against Roman law here. And King Agrippa, of course, was going to be kind of in the forefront of that particular quest, but the other guys would have been a part of it too. So, question 6: How had Festus, right here in a minute, how had Festus become tangled in the difficulty of his own making?
So he sent Paul to Caesar. Didn't have any charges, actually.
Yeah. Could you imagine that? I mean, that'd be like, sending somebody to the Supreme Court, and they say, okay, so what are the charges? We don't have any against him. I mean, what would you say? We throw the case out. So there has to be some kind of charge made against him, and you can't send a prisoner to Caesar with no charges. And he points out, that just simply that's unreasonable to think you could do that. It's irrational. It's ridiculous to try to do that. So he hoped that these guys could help him come up with this situation, because if they couldn't come up with a charge, what was going to happen?
It looks to me like they all know the score. Like he's saying, Jews hate this man, they want him dead. Verse 25, he's done nothing wrong. So you guys come up with something to send him on down the line with, because I'm hanging the one here.
Yeah.
That's how this reads to me. Like he's putting that monkey on their back.
Yeah, but I mean, it was his own doing. Why do I say that?
He could have let it go.
Yeah, I mean, when he stood before him and he himself recognized this isn't a question of Roman law. This is a question about Jewish law, customs and religion and their temple and their law. Doesn't have anything to do with a Roman court. He could have just said, okay, he's free to go. No charges. But he didn't do that. And because he didn't do that, Paul appealed and used his Roman citizenship to have the right to appeal before Caesar. And now he was kind of in a predicament here because he didn't know what he was going to charge him with. And so you couldn't send him there without some kind of charge. That's what he really was wanting from Agrippa, to help him come up with some violation or charge against Roman law that he could send along with Paul. So question number 7, how does Paul begin his address to Agrippa?
Like he normally does.
Okay, and expound on that a little bit. How would you say Paul is normally?
I think when he addresses someone in power like that, he always tells them, how important they are, kind of, and how he thinks that their decisions are going to be right.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, he knew Jewish law, and so he was glad to be before somebody that at least knew Jewish law and like business.
Yeah. So he obviously knew that Festus was out of his league here when you start talking about, the Jewish temple and the Jewish religion and Jewish law, because he knew he didn't have any knowledge or experience with those things. And so, he's being charged with breaking Jewish law, violating temple laws, breaking Jewish tradition and religion. And so he basically tells him, he says, man, I'm glad I'm standing in front of you. I'm glad that I get to stand in front of somebody who knows the law, who knows about the Jewish system and is experienced and, can understand the charges and can clearly see that I haven't broken any law, as he claimed, of course, in his trial with Festus. But he also tells him as he begins his speech, he pleads with him to be patient with him. He's basically saying, listen, this is going to be a long story here. Just kind of bear with me. I promise you I'm going somewhere with it. But just please be patient with me and listen to me and hear me out. And I'll get to the point of what I'm trying to make here eventually. But he is very respectful, and he does acknowledge the fact that Agrippa is a Jewish expert. He had the knowledge of customs and religion and the law of the Jews. So Paul talks a little bit about himself in verse 8. What does he say about his early years in Judaism?
He was a Pharisee.
Yeah, what does that mean? He lived as a Pharisee, right? What would that mean? Yeah, they were considered the strictest religious sect among the Jews in that day and age. Of course, we know the history of Paul. We know about his upbringing. We know that his father was a Pharisee, as he points out there. It wasn't that he was just a Pharisee, but he was one of the top Pharisees, wasn't he? He was a guy who was excelling in this role and in this sect and in this religion. And so Paul points out there as he begins talking to Agrippa, he says, listen, everybody knows my history. All these guys here know my past. They know what I was about. And they know my background, how I used to live and how I conducted myself. So question 9, what was Paul's obsession before he was converted?
Christians, mainly.
Yeah, he was the bitter enemy of Jesus, wasn't he? And basically he viewed it as his goal to zealously persecute the church. And what did that entail? What did that mean? How did he do that?
Well, they put him in prison and killed him.
Yeah, he tells about, of course, he talks about a little later how, I'll save that one. But he does talk about the fact that his goal was to try to get them to blaspheme Christ, wasn't it? And the way that he would do that is by persecuting, by torturing. So he wanted them to hear them verbally deny Jesus, and if he had a chance to contribute to them dying, he took it, didn't he? He talks about how he cast his vote against them. And so he was a guy who was standing, and this is something that we've emphasized time and time again, but he was standing where a lot of those Jews were standing that day. He knew what they were about. I mean, he knew all about their religion. He knew, about their zeal, and he had been one of those people formerly. So he's kind of given, again, you can understand why Paul's saying, just be patient with me here. I'm going to give a little life history, about what I was like before. But I got a point. I've got a point that I'm making and a place that I'm trying to go with it. So, question 10 here: how did Paul describe his conversion and his new life?
Well, he was telling about where he was traveling up to Damascus, telling about the bright light that was shining around him, and how he had fallen to the earth. And he went through the whole process of explaining all the details. But on the bright light shone around him, is there any more that we know about that? God's word?
Well, just what he says in the other accounts. I mean, I think what he says is brighter than the sun at noon. It wasn't the sun, but it was something that was brighter than the sun when it would be at its peak point in our atmosphere. He fell to the earth. Some people say it knocked him to the earth, perhaps. I don't know. But he did fall to the earth whenever he saw the light. We know, what else did it do to him? Blinded him. Right? So it was a pretty powerful light. He talks about that, and again, he's emphasized the way that he used to live and the kind of person that he was. What was it that changed Paul?
He saw Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and that's the point that I think he's really trying to make here. And he talked about a little earlier how he was a Pharisee and he believed in the hope of the resurrection. Think about that. That's what the Pharisees were all about, right? That was one of their main points, religious points, whenever they taught somebody. We have the hope of the resurrection. And what Paul is saying here is the resurrection changed my life. I saw a dead man. This is what we all believe in. This is what we all teach. And I saw it with my own eyes. I witnessed somebody who had been resurrected from the dead. And, of course, that was Jesus Christ. And of course, what did he point out that he learned there through this encounter?
He's wrong.
Yeah, he learned that, first of all, that Jesus wasn't dead, right? He was alive. He'd been resurrected from the dead. But he also learned that he was persecuting his people and that he was the Messiah. And so Paul's, he's talking about these things. He says, listen, we teach the hope of the resurrection. We believe that men are going to be raised from the dead. I saw one. And I saw Christ, and that's what changed my life. And I came to understand that he was the Messiah and that what I was doing was actually against his will. I was persecuting his church and his people. So he's kind of explaining, why this complete change took place in his life here. What I know this isn't on our handout here, but what commission did Jesus give Paul?
We told him to go to that place.
Damascus, yeah.
Damascus, and be told what he needed to do.
Yeah, and a guy by Ananias would come and tell him what he needed to do, right? We of course know that mission was Jesus sent him to go preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And how did Paul respond to that mission that Christ gave him? What did he talk about here? Yeah, he said, I did it, no questions asked. He points out there, it wasn't something that was up for discussion or debate. I didn't go talk to my friends and my family about it and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? When God told me to do something, I did it. I didn't disobey what he told me to do. And so again, he's explaining, how he got to this change in this point in time and why he's doing what he's doing. And it all has to do with the resurrection from the dead. That all has to do with seeing Jesus Christ having been resurrected from the dead. So you read about him talking directly. Well, Festus kind of interrupts at this particular point. What's Festus's view of Paul now? He said, you're a raving lunatic, But think about it. What if somebody stood up in court today and said that? I saw a dead guy. That's crazy, isn't it? But Festus, he wasn't a Jew. He didn't have the knowledge. He didn't understand all the background of these things. Now, Agrippa would, though, wouldn't he? And so it's kind of interesting to me how Paul interacts with these two individuals very differently from one another. And so Festus basically said, Paul, you've fallen off your rocker here. You're crazy with the things that you're talking about. And he just respectfully says, I'm not crazy. I'm telling you the truth. And the words that I'm speaking to you are words of honesty. And, of course, he also knew what the Scripture had to say, and he also pointed out, there's nothing wrong with my mind. I completely comprehend what I'm saying here and, how it looks.
The Jews here, the main point they were trying to get him put to death for, this one, as I understand it, is that they're accusing him of bringing Gentiles into the temple and desecrating the temple. Now, when they went about to put Jesus to death, they caught him for blasphemy because he was saying, I am essentially God. He said, I'm the Son of God. I'm the Messiah. I'm God. And they said, okay, we don't need any more witnesses. You're it.
Yeah.
Why weren't they straight to the point with Paul and said, we really want to kill you because you're saying Christ is the Messiah? And because he said that out loud, anybody that listened.
Yeah.
So why were they going around the back door here?
I don't know. I mean, as far as in Jewish court, it would have been considered blasphemy, I'm sure. But they weren't in Jewish court. That was the problem. And
it was a temple thing, though.
Yeah. And again, you're not talking about Roman law. I mean, you're in a Roman court. You got to bring some kind of Roman charge against him, and even the charge of the temple. Were there any witnesses who saw Paul bring a Gentile into the temple? Where were they? Remember at his first trial? Nobody showed up, right? Everybody just heard. We heard that Paul brought a Gentile into the temple, but were there any actual witnesses? No. And so it's going to be hard to charge him with that. First of all, if you don't have any witnesses, you're just kind of saying, well, this is hearsay. But secondly, you're in a Roman court, and so Festus and Agrippa are in charge, and the Jews know that. I think they're showing a little bit of respect and restraint in this particular area because they don't really have any jurisdiction in this Roman court. So Festus basically calls him a raving lunatic. Paul points out, I'm not crazy. What I'm telling you is the truth. My mind is sound. I understand how it sounds and how it looks, but this is the truth of the matter, and this is what happened. How does he talk to Agrippa? A little bit different, isn't it?
What his knowledge of them now. But really, Agrippa wasn't a true Jew by no means.
No.
But there, he did know and study, apparently there.
Well, I don't know that he didn't know as much as he just didn't care. Because, like we said, Rome was where his true allegiance was.
Yeah.
But he still oversaw the temple. He appointed the high priest. So he would have been familiar, I think, with Jewish law and prophets and things of that. And he was a Jew himself. Now, again, you think about his background. I don't know how much of that would have been instilled into him as a child, but didn't have the greatest of teachers and examples in his background. But it is interesting to me, basically Festus is saying you're crazy, and Paul turns to Agrippa and he said, you know what I'm talking about. You believe the prophets, don't you? What did the prophets teach about the resurrection? And that's the hope for everybody, isn't it? That we're going to rise again. Not that we're going to be dead forever, but we're going to rise again. And so he says, you know the prophets, you believe them, right? And how does Agrippa respond to that?
Almost a Christian.
Yeah, so I wish I had more time, but we're about out of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about this statement because it's interesting in the original language when you look at it. Basically, what Agrippa says, the word that's translated almost is the only time you'll find it in the Bible where it's translated almost. A lot of times it appears in the New Testament. It's usually going to be translated as few, little, or short. And so I don't know how you came up with almost unless you're just trying to directly assign a meaning to what Agrippa said, which I think was kind of the intent of translating it that way. But basically he says to Paul, he says, are you going to make me a Christian with these so few words? And some people take that to mean that he was almost persuaded by this short speech that Paul made. What do you think? Is that what Paul was saying? Or is that what Agrippa was saying? Or do you think it was Agrippa saying, Paul, you think you're going to convert me by that little short speech that you just made there? You think you're going to make me become a Christian with few words? Do you think Agrippa was almost a Christian? I doubt it. And I don't think a little speech made by Paul in 5 minutes was going to change his mind. Do you?
I've got to disagree with you.
Go ahead.
Because remember back when he talked to David, Stephen, he's likely to have to come in to get talk about that and get him worked up. He was scared. So I think that Paul was a very persuasive person.
Oh, I have no doubt that his words were powerful and effective. That's the nature of the gospel.
And no doubt, Agrippa had studied the problem. No doubt he knew some stuff. And after spending time down there, he may have thought, well, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah.
And maybe if you talk to some of these other guys who were called, because it says we all fell to the ground.
Yeah. It's just kind of interesting the way that it's translated. And does anybody have a different version that kind of translates it differently?
ESV,
What does it say?
it says, and Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time will you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become sympathizers except for these chains.
Yeah. So that's really the question, you know. And again, the word almost isn't in there. It's going to be short or little or few. And is he saying he's a little short of becoming a Christian, or is he just saying, you know, this little speech isn't going to make me a Christian?
It's sure gonna be bad on our song you was saying.
Oh, it is. And it does away with some good sermon titles, doesn't it? Almost a Christian. Yeah, you probably heard a million sermons on that. But yeah, sometimes you just have to grin and bear it. And I think that's one of those occasions where it's probably not translated like it should be. But all right. I wish we could talk about that a little more. We're out of time. Anybody got thoughts, comments, questions? Go ahead, Dan.
How long do you know how long it was? How long the first relationship with the same church around and he was changed at that point? Do we know what time frame that was? I know it was what, 3 days?
Yeah. Right. 3 days that he waited in the city for Ananias.
You know, I was comparing that, how long that was, to what the Agrippa says, almost persuaded.
Yeah.
All persuaded
Yeah.
in a short period of time.
Yeah, he was, for sure. But I'd also say Paul's heart was a little bit different than Agrippa's heart. All right. Appreciate the comments and discussion.